Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This one is titled the Graveyard Blues. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is we are going to scryfall.com. We are working with a budget of $100 and picking a random card, building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is a bit of an old one. It's Bamboozle. It's 2 and a blue for a sorcery. And it says, target player reveals the top 4 cards of his or her library. You choose 2 of those cards and put them into his or her graveyard. Put the rest on top of his or her library in any order. So honestly, I had never seen this card before. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And it took a little bit of planning and thinking, but eventually I realized that this target player could be ourselves. So we can reveal the top 4 cards of our deck, put 2 on top and 2 into the graveyard, letting us filter away some cards we don't need, put some cards into our graveyard to try to stock it a little bit, and also fix our next couple of draws so that way we're set up to get the things that we need. And so with that in mind, we actually went ahead and built a partner pairing. We have Ghost of Ramirez DePietro, 2 and a blue for a legendary creature Spirit Pirate for a 2/3. And the Ghost of Ramirez DePietro can't be blocked by creatures with toughness 3 or greater. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we choose up to 1 target card in a graveyard that was discarded or put there from a library this turn and put that card into its owner's hand. Bamboozle puts cards from our library directly into our graveyard. So the Ghost of Ramirez DePietro can actually get those cards back if there are some cards that we want back. And our second card, Glacian Powerstone Engineer, 5 and a blue for a human artificer, 3/6. We can tap and tap X untapped artifacts we control. Look at the top X cards of our library and put 1 of those cards into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. So with these 2 commanders at the helm, with Bamboozle in the deck, we are a self-mill deck. Our entire goal is to put as much of our library into our graveyard as possible, using our commanders. Glacian can help fuel the mill, put the cards in. The Ghost can get the cards back if there are certain ones that we need, and Bamboozle helps us fix the top of our deck and also puts cards into our graveyard for us. So that is the general idea of this deck, and obviously, when we take a look at our themes, our very first one is mill. We want to be able to mill ourselves, specifically more so than our opponents. So we did have to look for mill cards like Stream of Thought that target a player, not just target opponent or say each opponent. We specifically wanted cards that could mill ourselves. So Stream of Thought is 1 blue for a sorcery, target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, and then we can shuffle up to 4 cards from our graveyard into our library. It also has Replicate for 2, blue, so we can copy it for each time we pay its Replicate cost, and so we can cast this, mill ourselves for 4, and then if there are cards in our graveyard that we want back, we're able to shuffle them back in. So, milling ourselves, our main theme here. And then obviously to go along with our self-mill, we do want cards that work from the graveyard. So we found plenty of Embalm creatures, Eternalize creatures, Flashback. There's a lot of different abilities that we're able to activate from our cards once they get put into the graveyard. Vizier of Many Faces is a phenomenal example of that. That's 2 blue for a Shapeshifter Cleric for a 0/0. But it may enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except if it's embalmed, it's white, and is a zombie. So we can have our Vizier of Many Faces be any creature we want it to be. Maybe it dies, but once it's in the graveyard, we can bring it back. So whether we've used it and it's died once, or we milled it over as we were going through our self-mill plan, it's always going to be available to us. And finally, our third theme is bounce effects, or specifically mass bounce effects. Because we're milling ourselves, we don't have a ton of creatures, and we need to make sure we protect ourselves, because once our opponents figure out what we're doing, we're going to become an easy target. They're going to want to get rid of us. So Scourge of Fleets, 5 blue for a 6/6 Kraken When it enters the battlefield, we return each creature our opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands you control. Since we're mono blue, we're going to have tons of islands, and if we can get up to 7 mana without mana rocks, that means we're bouncing all of our opponent's creatures with toughness 7 or less. It's very unlikely that our opponents have anything bigger than that. If they do, we'll just have to figure something else out. There is other removal in the deck, but this saves us a few turns of getting attacked by some creatures. Might also protect some of the planeswalkers that we have in this deck, so mass bounce effects, very, very useful for us. And since we've taken a look at some of our themes, I do want to highlight a couple of key cards, some cards that we really want to get on the battlefield as quickly as we can when we're playing this deck. The first one, Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. He's 1 blue, blue, blue. For a legendary planeswalker, Jace comes in at 4 loyalty, and the important part here is his static ability. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. There are a few other effects that do this, Laboratory Maniac, Thassa's Oracle, same thing, but Jace Wielder of Mysteries is a little bit more important to us because of his other abilities. He can +1 to have target player mill 2 cards and then draw a card. So we could target ourselves, mill 2, and also draw a card. And then -8, draw 7 cards, and then if our library has no cards in it, we win the game. That's just on there so we can draw the 7, and if it kills himself, then we still win the game even if he's not there. So a super important piece of this deck, definitely a win condition once we get that far, but also a pretty good value engine just to have on board too. Our second key card is Leveler. I know a lot of people don't really like Leveler, but in this deck, it makes the deck run a little bit more smoothly. So it's 5 mana for an artifact creature. It's a 10/10. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from your library. Just the whole deck gone. Our self-mill plan is automatically completed. If we can play turn 4 Jace, turn 5 Leveler, plus Jace, we just win right there. Now, obviously, that's kind of a special scenario. That's not going to happen super often, but not unlikely, and is a good quick win condition if we need it. And finally, our third key card is Mirror Mad Phantasm. This is 3 blue blue for a 5/1 spirit with flying, and we can pay 1 in a blue, and we shuffle it back into our library, and then we reveal cards from the top of our deck until we reveal Mirror Mad Phantasm, and then we put Mirror Mad Phantasm onto the battlefield and all other cards revealed into the graveyard. Because this is a singleton format, we only have 1 Mirror Mad Phantasm, and sometimes we might shuffle it back in and get unlucky and it's near the top, but other times we might get super lucky and maybe it's in the bottom 20 cards of our deck and we just mill 60, 70 cards right then and there for only 2 mana. And the best part of it is, it puts itself back onto the battlefield. So if we can untap and we have 6 mana open, we can do this 3 times, hopefully getting more and more of our deck every time. And obviously it gets worse and worse the fewer cards that we have, but it's a good way to knock out a large portion of our deck very, very quickly. And now we've taken a look at some key cards, we've taken a look at some themes. The last thing I'd like to do before we get into the budget is highlight a couple of cool interactions that I found while putting this deck together that I think, if you're able to pull them off, make the deck seem just that much sweeter. So the first one is between Dig Through Time and Tunnel Vision. Dig Through Time being 6 blue blue for an instant with Delve. And it says, look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 into your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. And then Tunnel Vision is 5 and a blue for a sorcery that says name a card, target player, most likely going to be us, reveals cards from the top of their library until the named card is revealed. If it is, that player puts the rest of the revealed cards into his or her graveyard and puts the named card on top of their library. Otherwise, the player shuffles their library. So we do have to name a card that's in our deck, otherwise Tunnel Vision just shuffles our deck for us, and we don't really want that. But Dig Through Time specifically says we put the cards on the bottom of our library in any order, which means we choose which card goes on the very bottom of our library. So we can dig through time at the end of our opponent's turn for 2 mana, choose a card to put on the bottom. Doesn't matter which one, we just have to make sure we remember what it is. And then on our turn, we cast Tunnel Vision. We name the card that's on the bottom of our library, and we put every single card in our deck, except for one, into our graveyard, and we put the revealed card into our hand. Meaning we immediately get rid of our entire library. It's already in the graveyard, and if we have something like Jace, Laboratory Maniac, or Thassa's Oracle, we could just win right there. And the second cool interaction that I thought was pretty neat going through this deck is between Fleet Swallower and Fraying Sanity. So when these two cards first came out, personally, I tried to build a bit of a standard deck around them. It didn't work out. Fleet Swallower, super expensive, not the easiest to work with, but I never realized both of these cards can choose the player they target. So Fleet Swallower is 7 mana for a 6/6 fish. Whenever it attacks, target player puts the top half of their library rounded up into their graveyard. So it doesn't have to be the person that Fleet Swallower is attacking. We can target ourselves with it. And then Fraying Sanity, 2 and a blue, for an Aura Curse, enchant player. Again, we can enchant ourselves. And at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into the graveyard from anywhere this turn. So if we attack with Fleet Swallower, we target ourselves, we mill half of our deck, we move to our end step, Fraying Sanity says, hey, you milled over, we'll say 40 cards, mill over another 40 cards. So we put the top half in with Fleet Swallower and the rest in with Fraying Sanity. That's again an instant mill, our entire deck is gone, and hopefully we have a way to win from there. So that is the deck in general. We do have our budget of $100, which in this case, using TCG Mid, we came out to about $90.25. So not super expensive. We didn't quite hit the budget limit, but there are definitely some cards that could be cut from this if you're looking to cut some budget. The main one, Thassa's Oracle, about $8.40. So if you cut the Oracle, you could get it down almost to $80. And the Oracle is not necessary. We have Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. We have Laboratory Maniac. There are other ways to win that don't involve Thassa's Oracle. Thassa's Oracle is just the easiest way to do it because it's a trigger that goes on the stack. They can kill it, they can do whatever they want, but unless they counter it, we'll win with it. That's why it's a little bit better than the other two, but it's definitely not necessary if you were to put this deck together. So that's the deck. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We do have one more thing to do, though, and that is to see how it plays against some opponents, because I can talk about the deck as much as I want, but until we see it in action, who knows what it actually does. So our opponents for today are going to be Lord Windgrace, played by Ezra, Omnath, Locus of Creation, played by Shawn, and Kumena, Tyrant of Orazca, played by Jason. So Ezra's Lord Windgrace deck is not your traditional Lands Matter deck. It's actually a Jund Dragons deck, and I've played against it a few times. It is very powerful. It can be very explosive. I'm kind of hoping that our opponents draw some of the heat from the dragons so that way we can sneak out a bit of a victory. Omnath, Locus of Creation. This one is a lands deck. Again, very powerful. 4 colors means that Shawn has access to most of the land cards that he needs for this. And the ability of Omnath to draw a card when it comes in, plus generate a bunch of value every time he plays a land, is definitely not something to be underrated. And finally, Kumena, Jason's Merfolk tribal deck. Merfolk tend to be a little bit smaller, definitely not as big as dragons, but there's usually a lot more of them. And so the concern there, especially because we're mono blue, is that Merfolk can be kind of small, but a lot of them have island walk. So if they start walking over our islands, there's not much we can do, even if we get something like a Scourge of Fleets online that could block, they might just get around it. So we'll see how the game goes. I'm Interested to see how we match up. There are some very aggressive strategies at this table, and ours is definitely not aggressive, so hopefully we can survive long enough to mill ourselves out, but we'll see how it goes. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I will talk to you all after the game. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Ezra, Shawn, and Jason. On our first turn, I play an island. Ezra plays a terramorphic expanse, cracking it for a swamp. Shawn plays a forest. Jason plays an island. I play a scavenger grounds and then cast Sweet Oblivion, milling myself for 4. Ezra plays a Dragon Skull Summit and then casts Dragon Lord's Servant, reducing the cost of his dragons by 1. Shawn plays an island, casts a Coiling Oracle, putting a Plains into play. And Jason casts a Yavimaya Coast, and then casts a Kumena's Speaker. On my turn, I play an island, and cast Jace Beleren, activating his +2 ability so that everyone draws a card. Ezra plays a forest, and then casts Ramunap Excavator, and then attacks me for 1 with his Dragon Lord's Servant. Shawn casts a Nature's Lore, putting a Stomping Grounds into play, and then plays a forest and passes. Jason plays a forest and casts Deeproot Waters, which makes a 1/1 Merfolk with Hexproof whenever he casts a Merfolk spell. I play an island and activate Jace's +2 so everyone draws a card, and then pass. Ezra plays a command tower, and then casts Wasitora Nekoru Queen before attacking Jason for 2 and Shawn for 1. On Shawn's turn, he casts Omnath, Locus of Creation, drawing a card, and then plays a command tower, gaining 4 life. Jason plays an island, and then casts Kumena, Tyrant of Orazka, making a Merfolk token. Then at the end of his turn, I cast Factor Fiction, letting Ezra split my top 5 cards into 2 piles, and he puts 3 islands and a Mind Stone into one, and a Court of Cunning into the other, and I take the pile with 4 cards. On my turn, I play an island, activate Jace's +2 to let everyone draw a card, and then cast Mind Stone, followed up by Bamboozle. This lets me put Ipnu Rivulet and Champion of Wits into the graveyard, and a Laboratory Maniac and Vizier of Many Faces on top of my deck. Ezra plays a Taiga, and then casts Obsidian Charmaw, destroying Shawn's command tower when it enters. He then casts a Boneyard Scourge, before moving to combat and attacking Jason for 5 with Wasitora. Before the damage, Jason taps 3 Merfolk to draw a card with Kumena's ability, and then he takes 5 and sacrifices his Merfolk token. Ezra also attacks Jace Beleren for 3 damage, keeping him away from his ultimate. Shawn casts a Retreat to Kazandu, and then plays a forest, putting a +1/+1 counter on Omnath and gaining 4 life. He follows that up with a Kodama's Reach, putting a land to hand and 1 into play, which lets him put another counter on Omnath and make 4 mana. Jason plays a Mutavault, and then casts a Reflections of Litjara, naming Merfolk. This makes him a copy of every Merfolk that he casts. On my turn, I activate Jace's +2, so everyone draws a card. I play a Hostile Desert, and then cast a Mirror Mad Phantasm. Ezra plays a Forest, and then casts a Scourge of Valkus, doing 4 damage to Mirror Mad Phantasm. In response, I activate the Phantasm's ability to shuffle it into my library and reveal cards until I hit the Mirror Mad Phantasm, putting it into play and putting the rest of the cards into my graveyard. Ezra then goes to combat and attacks me for 5 and Shawn for 8. I block, killing both the Mirror Mad Phantasm and Wasitora. On Shawn's turn, he casts Omnath, Locus of Rage, making him a 5/5 elemental token whenever he plays a land. He then plays an island, making an elemental and gaining 5 life. He moves to combat and attacks me for 6 with the Locus of Creation. Jason plays a Fabled Passage, and then casts a Silvergill Adept, making a copy of it and drawing 2 cards as they both enter, and also making a Merfolk token. He then moves to combat and attacks Jace for 4, putting him down to 4 loyalty. In his second main phase, he casts a Wake Thrasher, making a copy of it and also a Merfolk token. He then cracks his Fabled Passage for an island and passes. On my turn, I play an island, activate Jace's +2 so everyone draws a card, casts a Soul Ring, and then I cast a Scourge of Fleets, returning all my opponent's creatures with 5 or less toughness to their owner's hands, leaving only Shawn's commander. However, in response, Jason taps his Merfolk to draw 2 cards before they're bounced to his hand. On Ezra's turn, he recasts Dragonlord's Servant, and then recasts Obsidian Charmaw, destroying my Scavenger Grounds. He then follows that up with the Ramunap Excavator. Shawn plays a Blighted Woodland and immediately cracks it, putting 2 lands into play. This has him gaining 6 life, making 4 mana, doing 4 damage to each opponent and Planeswalker, and putting 2 counters on Omnath. He then recasts Omnath, Locus of Rage. Jason plays an island, and then casts Metallic Mimic, naming Merfolk, so all his Merfolk enter with an additional +1/+1 counter, and recasts Kumeta's Speaker, copying it, making a Merfolk token, and then also recasts a Silvergill Adept, copying it, making another Merfolk token, and drawing 2 more cards. Then, at the end of his turn, I flashback a Dream Twist to mill myself for 3. On my turn, I play an island, and then activate Jace's +2 to have everyone draw a card, and then I flashback Deep Analysis to draw 2 cards. Ezra plays a Terramorphic Expanse from his graveyard, cracking it for a mountain, and then casts an Immersturm Predator, before casting Crux of Fate to destroy all non-dragon creatures. However, in response, Jason casts a counterspell to counter the board wipe, and then Ezra moves to combat, attacking me for 4 in the air. Shawn casts a Coiling Oracle, putting Austere Command to hand, and then casts Cultivate, putting 1 land into play and 1 to hand, gaining 4 life, making an elemental, and putting a counter on the Locus of Rage. He then plays a Plains, making 4 mana, an elemental, and putting a counter on Locus of Creation, and casts Trove Warden, and then casts Urban Evolution, drawing 3, playing a Selesnya Sanctuary, returning a forest to hand, which does 4 damage to each opponent and Planeswalker, killing Jace, making an elemental, and putting a counter on Locus of Creation. He then attacks me for 13 with both Omnaths, and before damage, I cast a Mission Briefing, surveilling 2, and letting me cast Aether Spouts out of my graveyard to return Shawn's attackers to the top of his library. On Jason's turn, he casts a Thieving Skydiver Kicked, stealing my Soul Ring, making a copy of it, and also making a Merfolk token. And he recasts his commander Kumena, making a Merfolk token, and attacks me for 12. But I block the Silvergill Adept, only taking 9. On my turn, I play an island, and cast Vizier of Many Faces, copying Scourge of Fleets to bounce all of my opponent's creatures with toughness 7 or less to hand, hitting everything on board. In response, Jason taps his merfolk to draw a card. I then cast Jace Memory Adept and activate his 0 ability to mill myself for 10, leaving me with only 4 cards in my library. Ezra recasts Obsidian Charmaw, destroying Shawn's Selesnya Sanctuary, casts a Karthus Tyrant of Jund, giving all his dragons haste, and then attacks me for 11, knocking me out of the game. On Shawn's turn, he recasts Omnath, Locus of Creation, drawing a card, shocks in a Temple Garden, gaining 4 life and losing 2, and then casts a Coiling Oracle, putting a forest to play and making 4 mana. And he follows that up with Harrow, sacrificing a land to put 2 more into play, doing 4 damage to each opponent, and putting a total of 4 counters on Omnath, Locus of Creation. On Jason's turn, he plays a Novagen, Heart of Progress, recasts Metallic Mimic, naming Merfolk, recasts Kumeta Speaker, copying it and making a Merfolk token, casts a Shaper's Apprentice, copying it and making a Merfolk token, and then casts Merfolk Branchwalker, copying it, making a Merfolk token, and exploring twice. Ezra casts a Fiery Emancipation to triple his damage, but Shawn counters it with a Negate. Ezra then casts a Crucible of Fire, giving all his dragons +3/+3, before moving to combat and attacking Shawn for 10 with Karthus. Shawn recasts Omnath, Locus of Rage, and then casts Ramunap Excavator, which lets him play Selesnya Sanctuary out of his graveyard, returning a forest to hand, gaining 5 life, and making an elemental. He then puts a Simic Growth Chamber into play with Walking Atlas, gaining 4 mana, making an elemental, and gaining 2 life. He then casts Abundance, and follows that up by casting a Trove Warden. On Jason's turn, he casts a Tempest Caller to tap all of Shawn's creatures. He also copies it, tapping Ezra's board, and makes a Merfolk token, before attacking Shawn for 24 with all of his Merfolk. In his second main phase, he casts a Wake Thrasher, copying it and making another Merfolk token. On Ezra's turn, he casts a Boneyard Scourge, and then casts a Scourge of Valkus, doing 4 damage to Shawn, and attacks Jason for 7 and Shawn for 15 with his dragons. On Shawn's turn, he casts Tatiova, gaining him a life and drawing a card whenever he plays a land. Then he plays Selesnya Sanctuary, bouncing Simic Growth Chamber to hand, gaining 7 life, drawing a card, and making an elemental. He then uses Walking Atlas to put Simic Growth Chamber back into play, bouncing the Sanctuary, gaining 3 more life, drawing a card, making 4 mana, and making an elemental. He then casts a Swiftfoot Boots, and equips them to an elemental that has Summoning Sickness. And moving to combat, Shawn attacks Ezra for 38 damage. However, before the damage, Jason casts Pongify, turning the Locus of Rage into a 3/3 ape. Ezra then blocks the Locus of Creation, killing it, but unfortunately still dies to combat damage. On Jason's turn, he's unable to draw an answer and can't push through enough damage, so he decides to concede, winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a super close game. We came so close to winning at the end there. We had 4 cards left in our deck, and if we had been allowed to untap, we definitely could have won with everything that we had. I wasn't counting on 11 hasty damage coming in from the dragons, but you know what? We tried. We gave it our best. And I think in the end, the value of the lands deck definitely put them ahead of the rest of us. Shawn's Omnath deck put up a good show. Honestly, everyone's deck put up a good show. I think everyone did very well in this game. And it's just a little unfortunate that we sat down with a non-aggressive strategy against 3 aggressive strategies, so we definitely looked like a target pretty early on, but I think the deck was super fun. We definitely came close. I can see the power in this deck, so I would love to give it another shot at some point in the future, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech and the gameplay. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please do let me know. I'm always happy to take recommendations on cards to build for new decks. And please subscribe to the channel, leave me some comments. I'd love to hear some feedback. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.